Thanks, Stan and Yasmin, for the introduction. I'm sure everyone here knows me probably. So thanks for inviting me to speak. The As I said just before, I am in Berlin, where the political climate around the Israel's war on Gaza and the cancelling of left-wingers, Muslims, Jewish pro-peace campaigners accused of anti-Semitism has reached quite extraordinary levels. Jeremy Corbyn was cancelled from speaking at a Rosa Luxemburg Foundation event a couple of weeks ago and wasn't even given a reason. It was insinuated, though, that he was an anti-Semite. And a lot of the discussion in Germany at the moment has a lot to do with the kind of things I'll be talking about in the French context. In particular, the increasing tendency across the political spectrum to treat anti-Semitism as an ill that has been imported into German society, or is being imported by Muslim immigrants, and the insistence that Muslims in particular should have to make declarations of allegiance to Israel's security, as proposed by the leader of the Christian Democrats, in order to be able to gain or citizenship or remain citizens. And it's quite obvious that in this context, it's become easy for parties who are anti-immigrant forces and parties who pose Islam and the presence of Muslim immigrants as a civilizational threat. It's easy for them to use the language of fighting anti-Semitism in order to demonize Muslims and their own target groups. I believe the reason why Yasmin asked me to speak, and indeed the title of the talk, referred to an article I had written about 3 weeks ago on the occasion for Jacobin magazine, on the occasion of the so-called March Against Anti-Semitism, which was held in Paris on 12th of November. In previous years, this kind of initiative, in this case, it was taken by the president of the parliament, Yael Braun-Pivet, who's a member of Emmanuel Macron's party. But the similar kinds of initiatives have taken place after other kind of terrorist attacks and killings, notably in 2018 when a Holocaust survivor, Mireille Knoll, was murdered. In the past, these kind of sort of demonstrations of Republican unity, solidarity with the victims of anti-Semitism, or solidarity with the victims of Islamist terrorist attacks, have tended to exclude Marine Le Pen and her Rassemblement National party, formerly known as Front National, of course. And 12th of November was different because she did attend, and there was some controversy among liberal bourgeois outlets about the fact that she would be attending the march. But there was no real call for her to be banned from taking part, to be excluded. None of the organizations involved, so Macron's party or CRIF, the CRIF, it's the Representative Council of Jewish Institutions in France. It's a little like the Board of Deputies. Some of them said they weren't happy marching next to her, pointed out her party's past, its origins, talked about the kind of historical guilt still attached to the party, but none of them boycotted it. They didn't really try to stop her attending. In fact, the march very much sealed Le Pen's entrance into the Republican mainstream and acceptability. And the glue for this was her unyielding and unconditional support for Israel's war, the destruction of Hamas, the defense of what she calls Judeo-Christian civilization against Islamist barbarism. And this kind of language is very typical across the far right of French politics, but obviously draws from a vocabulary promoted by the Israeli government itself and large parts of sort of bourgeois European media and opinion formation. And one sort of notable aspect of this, I think, and what I'm going to talk about, is the fact that the contemporary support for Israel was quite widely represented as a breaking off of the past. So maybe Jean-Marie Le Pen had founded the Front National together with former SS members, with a neo-Nazi group called Groupe Union Défense, GUD. So he was a Holocaust denier, convicted Holocaust denier, surrounded himself with former collaborationists in the Vichy regime and so on. But while that sort of negative image still attaches to the party, the lesson told even by outlets like the New York Times, Guardian, so on, is that Marine Le Pen has made a clean break. She has decided to reject that past, to turn away from it. The Guardian, in fact, ran a headline which said directly that Marine Le Pen had made a break from the party's anti-Semitic past. So the marketing operation was successful, or perhaps we might say it was notable how many outlets, how prominent, and were willing to accept that Le Pen had indeed made this change of heart, modernization, and mainstreaming of her party. Certainly at the level of internal communications within the party, or the expectations or identity of its militants, this creates some problems, which aren't just a matter of their own sort of personal feelings, but sort of trouble and question the overall enterprise of what's often called demonization, the sort of detoxification of Le Pen's party. A very indicative example of this, which I mentioned in the article, is an interview with Jourdain Bardella, who's the president of the Rassemblement National as a party, and also its lead candidate in the European elections for next June. And during this controversy about Le Pen's attendance at the march, he was interviewed on, I think it was on Europe 1 radio station, about what sense does it make for an anti-Semitic party to join a march against anti-Semitism. And Bardella said that it was a nonsense to call the Rassemblement National an anti-Semitic party, because after all, Marine Le Pen had broken with her father, Jean-Marie, precisely on the issue of anti-Semitism, with reference to his expulsion from the party, the father's expulsion from the party some 6 years ago. The reporter then asked Bardella whether Jean-Marie Le Pen is indeed an anti-Semite, and Bardella replied by saying that Jean-Marie Le Pen, that he didn't believe that Jean-Marie Le Pen was anti-Semitic. So in what the party is saying about itself now is both, well, we have moved on, we have modernized, we are not an anti-Semitic party, but at the same time denies that Jean-Marie Le Pen was himself an anti-Semite. In fact, if you look at Marine Le Pen's memoir, where she talks about her split with her father, she very strongly couches the dispute between them in terms of PR and vocabulary and the choice of words. In fact, she criticizes Jean-Marie Le Pen not as an anti-Semite, but for the fact that his comments about the Holocaust, for instance, calling the gas chambers a small detail of history, were not meant to hurt anyone's feelings, but were abrasive language that caused conflict and thereby undermined the party's strategy of modernization and mainstreaming. So the dispute wasn't about the whether he's an anti-Semite. She made no such suggestion, but rather claimed that his provocative language was the wrong rhetorical strategy, the wrong way of presenting the party. Still, so Front National militants like her, they don't want to say, well, yeah, we were anti-Semites until 5 minutes ago, but now we've changed. So it's not just about embracing Israel and saying Israel is good. It's also about kind of prettifying the party's past in a way that manages to sort of hold in tension that the idea of we are modernizing, we're new, we're changed, we're not like these bad old fascists you think, but at the same time sort of muddies the waters about whether the previous perception of the party was indeed fair. Still, this wasn't and I'll stop soon talking about this recent dispute about this march, but the other interesting aspect of it, which I think is very telling, was the way in which the discussion was immediately rerouted by various Rassemblement National representatives and other far-right figures into a debate about Muslim anti-Semitism. So Marion Maréchal, who is the niece of Marine Le Pen and granddaughter of Jean-Marie, who's in a rival electoral list for the European election, Reconquête, the party headed by Eric Zemmour. She said in an interview following Bardela's remarks, she said, well, if Jean-Marie Le Pen had been listened to on immigration and the Islamization of France 40 years ago, there'd certainly be less anti-Semitism today. So again, obviously the message is anti-Semitism is a cancer being imported into France by Muslim immigrants. Had only Jean-Marie Le Pen been listened to, those immigrants wouldn't have come. The anti-Semitism would be less. So I think that this Islamization of anti-Semitism, this claim that it's Muslims who are importing this ill, is a very typical sort of logical model of the way in which far-right parties generally and internationally are achieving their mainstreaming. If we think of a different example, which is raised by the scholar Sarah Faris, who has this idea of Femonationalism. Another version of it is homo-nationalism. Basically, what it does is contradicts the claim that far-right parties are indeed sexist and homophobic by claiming that it is immigrants, and particularly Muslims, who do not respect women's and gay rights. So this isn't true of all far-right parties in Europe, but it's very much the case if we take the example of Geert Wilders, the Dutch far-right leader who won the election a couple of Wednesdays ago, and before him, Pim Fortuyn in the Netherlands, very common in the Scandinavian countries as well, a bit less so in Southern Europe. This claim that these nationalist parties are fully signed up to individual civil liberties, of the formal equality of women and gay people, but that our societies, which are built on these rights, and indeed the claim is made, have been built on individual liberties sort of since time immemorial, are today threatened by immigrants from an Islamic culture who do not respect those values. So this kind of poses these groups, or large sections of society, women and gay people, as in fact protected by these nationalist parties, not their enemies. The clear attempt by Rassemblement National is to make the same connection with regard to Jews and the threat of anti-Semitism. So Bardella, the Rassemblement National party president, in the same remarks I just mentioned, he used this phrase that the Rassemblement National is the shield for France's Jews against Islamist ideology. And it's a line that Le Pen has used before herself, the claim that, in fact, their party is the strongest defender of Judeo-Christian civilization against Islam and Islamists. What this does, as well as sort of incorporating Jews and Judaism and Jewishness into the sort of fabric of the national story. So not just a Catholic and white country, but one of which is built on the Judeo-Christian past, is also, of course, to crush the uniqueness or separateness of Judaism into a national story, a national politics built on basically Catholic and Christian categories, but also on the secularism of the French state. So I think to take an example of this kind of crushing of Judaism into Judeo-Christian civilization, part of a clash of civilizations with Islam, an indicative example is the fact that is the discussion around the kind of banning of veils, banning of religious clothing, not just in public schools, but also in public places. Of course, and the most discussed and sort of politically hot example is the fact that the Rassemblement National favor the banning of any kind of Islamic clothing in public spaces. But the same ban apply, or the call it makes, the same ban would also apply to items like yarmulkes or kippas, so-called. A banning of signs of Jewish religious affiliation in public space. And while this measure might itself be seen as sort of anti-Semitic, and indeed one that had already been taken up by the Vichy regime during World War II, Le Pen appeals to France's Jews to accept such measures in the name of solidarity against Islam. So there's a sort of famous 2017 interview where Le Pen says that a Jew in France who wears a kippah or yarmulke in the street is at risk of being attacked by Muslims. But still, she added that she thinks the struggle against radical Islam has to be a joint struggle among both Catholics and Jews, and therefore everyone has a sacrifice to make. So since it would be patently discriminatory to issue a ban against Muslim veils, but not also against the yarmulke, Jews should accept the banning of the yarmulke in the name of the higher purpose of banning displays of Muslim religious affiliation. So, of course, most Jews in France don't wear these items, but in the name of solidarity, defense of Judeo-Christian civilization, anything to mark them apart is unwelcome. So what I talk about in the article is really that this solidarity with Israel, this recruitment of Jews to the defense of a common Judeo-Christian civilization, conforms to a kind of split between two different ideas of Jewishness and two ideas of Jewish identity that have historically colored anti-Semitism. And here I'm drawing on a guy called Valerio Renzi, who's an Italian journalist about the far right, and wrote a recent article about this. I have no need to pretend this is my own innovation, but it's pretty simple. So basically, it's two different types of Jewishness. On the one hand is what Renzi calls the Sovereigntist Jew. So basically an ethno-nationalist idea of Israel as a quasi-European country, as an outpost, a vanguard of Western resistance to Islamic and Islamist barbarism. So in fact, collapsing any distinctions or divisions within Israeli society, or for instance, the distinction between kind of core Israel and new settlers. This basically paints Israel as a country that's existed from time immemorial, which is now being besieged by rising third world forces. And the way it's talked about is very similar to the way in which, for example, historically, French Algeria or drawing on the categories of the sort of threat of reverse colonization, the idea of the formerly colonized people overwhelming the West. So basically, the whole history of European anti-Semitism is cast aside, and we instead have Israel as the kind of cutting edge of Europe and its defense. Then, opposed to this idea of the sovereigntist Jew, is the cosmopolitan Jew. So, in anti-Semitic terms, characterized by rootlessness, disloyalty, lack of connection to nation, preference for abstract and ideological schemes over the realities of nation rootedness identity. So Israel provides the kind of passage between these two things, because on the one hand, it's possible to maintain a hostile attitude towards Jews in one's own country, or to revive classically anti-Semitic ideas about the role of Jews in the economy, plus in sort of political, etc., power, while also expressing one's solidarity for Israel over there. And if we look at other examples of far-right parties in Europe, we can see how this is kind of concretized in the kind of in the form of paying a visit to Israel in order to receive its blessing from its government as a performance of acceptance of one's rejection of one's sort of escape from being considered anti-Semitic. A great example of this is Gianfranco Fini, who was the leader in the 1990s and 2000s of the Alleanza Nazionale, the former neo-fascist party, which is today Fratelli d'Italia, Giorgia Meloni's party. In 2003, he paid a visit to Israel. He visited the Yad Vashem Holocaust Museum, and he said that the Holocaust was the greatest crime of the 20th century, the absolute evil. So the performance of this, and sort of gullibly celebrated by most Italian media, was that he had gone to Israel to repent, but also to receive the blessing of the Israeli government. So now the charge of anti-Semitism was scrubbed out. So what sense does it make to say that Rassemblement National is still an anti-Semitic party? What's anti-Semitic about it? Without doubt, there's a difference relative to the far right of the early 20th century in terms of the relative importance of Jewish enemies in its rhetoric, in its program, in what it aims to achieve. We're in fact unlikely to hear Marine Le Pen make any kind of generalized comments about what she thinks about Jews, what Jews are doing, what role Jews have in French society. In fact, she studiedly avoids doing so. Specific references to the Holocaust or the questioning of the crimes of Nazi Germany and Vichy France are also relatively unlikely to appear in anything she says compared to her father, Jean-Marie Le Pen. Back in the day, Jean-Marie Le Pen often sought to provoke scandal by minimizing the Holocaust. In a different way, if we look at Marine Le Pen's rival to her right today, Eric Zemmour, himself from a family of Berber Jews, during his 2022 presidential campaign, he often tried to use discussion of Vichy France in order to provoke controversy and to attract attention to himself, notably by claiming that the Vichy French state and its leader, Philippe Pétain, had in fact been a shield for French Jews, had tried to protect them from the Nazi German occupier, saying that Vichy France basically sacrificed foreign Jews in France in order to save French Jews. Marine Le Pen generally tries to avoid doing this. She says that France did not take part in the Holocaust, but does so by falling back on what was until the 1990s a very typical very typical in Gaullist and even left-wing political culture, really the claim that because Vichy didn't represent France, but instead Charles de Gaulle represented France, it can't be said that the actions of the French puppet government are cast blame on France as a country. So I think that the anti-Semitism that continues to exist in the Rassemblement National doesn't really have to do with attitudes towards the Holocaust or Israel, nor does it paint Jews in general as some sort of threat to Christian or to France's Christian identity. What we instead see is the continuation of a kind of social anti-Semitism, purged of its explicit reference to Jews as a group, but which nonetheless uses many, but nonetheless maintains the same kind of idea of social structure typical of classic anti-Semitic theories. A really interesting book in this regard is Michel Elchnaninov's book, Inside the Mind of Marine Le Pen, where he talks about the way in which she and figures in the party more generally renew anti-Semitic tropes by subtly altering the language in a way which means that basically she escapes being given a hard time for what she's saying by liberal and mainstream media, but her own followers, her own listeners, the militants of the party still hear what they want. So he gives examples such as, for example, the idea that society is dominated by a institution called the bank. So this is an idea drawn from Alain Soral, a anti-Semitic conspiracy theorist with whom Le Pen has in fact broken, but she still uses the idea. So it's the idea that there's the bank, this kind of shadowy institution that dominates and corrupts society. So it's a bit like, and indeed includes the explicit reference to the idea that, for example, that the European Union is manipulated by the Rothschilds, that it is a Moloch, that, for example, mainstream politicians have submitted themselves to the bank, waiting on the credit agency's words as if waiting for the word of the Messiah. So there's a kind of religiously inflected language, but also the reference to the likes of the Rothschilds, the idea of George Soros as this kind of global manipulator, globalists uprooted, who are manipulating institutions through unknowable and abstract power. This is combined with the idea that we're living under a kind of empire of the artificial, where rootedness and identity are replaced by an abstract and unproductive capitalism, the world of finance that has taken over from the institutions that are knowable, basically the idea of a kind of productive and national economy which is being ruined because of the manipulations of speculators, usurers, financiers. So, of course, these aren't referred to as Jews. The reference, the connection with Jews isn't explicitly made, but Elchaninov argues that because of the reference to the likes of Soros or Rothschilds and so on, the connection is still made in the militants or the listener's mind. At the same time, there's an attempt to reverse the language in which is typically used to condemn the far right. So, for example, the use of the word collabo, like a collaborationist, typically meaning Vichyite collaborationist with Nazi Germany, is instead applied to liberals or leftists who are accused of collaborating with financial capitalism, with the likes of Soros and so on, in destroying France through immigration. So the idea of the new occupation, the idea that the resistance fought to free France, but now instead it's being taken over by another invader. It's the nation is again being destroyed by the manipulations of financiers importing African and Muslim immigrants. So basically, great replacement theory. Sometimes the expression isn't used. So I think what's interesting in this kind of rhetorical strategy and the sort of political program it is bound up with is that a classically anti-Semitic idea that the national capitalism is being manipulated, distorted by secretive groups, by globalists who like roots in the nation and so on. This kind of classic social figure of the 20th century anti-Semitism is actually combined with a kind of nostalgia for sort of post-war France. So the kind of Gaullist era, which is indeed precisely the France that the party was originally set up in opposition to, is idealized quite wrongly, also quite inaccurately, as a kind of era of social peace, when hard work produced good results, when French families could expect welfare and this kind of thing. So this too is kind of part of the mainstreaming of the Front National, is that having originated as an anti-Gaullist far-right force, it now claims Gaullism, and even in a very non-specific sense, the resistance as part of its own heritage. It claims to renew the struggle of Joan of Arc and Charles de Gaulle to keep France free of invaders, attackers. So, with all the with everything I'm sort of talking about in terms of the sort of tropes or the sort of recasting of social anti-Semitism in a language which is less explicitly anti-Semitic, although still full of references to the outsiderishness of financiers who happen to have Jewish surnames and so on. What's very notable in the sort of dominant sort of political media reaction to this is that it doesn't identify this as anti-Semitic. And indeed, I think quite obviously, the real difference is the way in which mainstream media and the dominant bourgeois parties choose to react to this compared to the way they talk about the left, which is identified as the source of anti-Semitism par excellence. Indeed, in France, there is a campaign against Jean-Luc Mélenchon and La France Insoumise in particular, which closely echoes the campaign against Jeremy Corbyn's Labour Party in Britain, albeit with the notable difference that in general, by and large, France Insoumise representatives have been far less willing to take it seriously, to apologize or back down. So, for instance, in recent weeks, we've seen that France Insoumise has refused to refer to Hamas as a terrorist organization. It refers to, some of its representatives have referred to it as a resistance group. Of course, one could question whether literally the term terrorist is indeed appropriate, and whether that term always and exclusively has a negative connotation. But broadly, what we're seeing is that France Insoumise have very solidly insisted that the overwhelming weight of guilt and responsibility is on the Israeli occupation, and have been sort of called anti-Semitic by even by liberal left outlets, even by some of their former sort of social democratic allies, because they refuse the demonization and refuse the rationale and the sort of liberal rationale for Israel's war. In fact, France Insoumise, alone among major political parties, refused to join the march against anti-Semitism in Paris on November the 12th. It offered slightly different, slightly contradictory reasons for doing so. Either that it would have marched had Le Pen not been invited, but it refused to march alongside Nazis, and the press statement issued called Le Pen a Nazi, or alternatively, that the march against anti-Semitism was in fact merely a pro-Israel march. So Mélenchon sort of publicly said, the unconditional supporters of Israel's, I think he said war rather than genocide, but Israel's war in Gaza, the supporters of Israel's war in Gaza, they have their rendezvous, they have their appointment to go on this so-called march against anti-Semitism, but which isn't really one. So organizations like the CRIF I mentioned earlier, this Representative Council of Jewish Institutions of France, or the parliamentary president, Yael Braun-Pivet, have very strongly focused on the radical left, or so-called France Insoumise, as basically the source, the instigator of anti-Semitism, because of their contemporary stance, whereas instead Le Pen's anti-Semitism is merely residual, part of the party's past, part of militant folklore, like kind of admirers of Vichy who haven't got over it yet, but basically an issue of the past that can be resolved by kind of purging the party, by modernizing its image, and so on. Without doubt, within CRIF, there is some dispute over how far they should go in accepting Le Pen in this manner. So the current president of the CRIF, which, as I say, is somewhat like the Board of Deputies in Britain, Jonathan Arfi, he has, in general, and including in the 2022 presidential election, resorted to this kind of anti-fascist opposition to Le Pen, using the language of, she's a threat to Jews. She wants to do things like remove the tax privileges for Jewish religious schools, but also she's a far-right danger to democracy. And Arfi also criticized her presence at the demonstration on November the 12th. Broadly, his responses to her conform to the political support for Emmanuel Macron. In fact, Macron himself went even further than the CRIF president in saying of Le Pen, well, no one should mistake dislike of Muslims for support for France's Jews. But what Jonathan Arfi is doing is basically a liberal support for the centrist and centre-right government against Le Pen, but shies from absolutely boycotting her, refusing to march alongside her, this kind of thing. However, within CRIF, different stances exist. So telling example is Roger Kuckerman, who was president of CRIF in the early 2000s and a second time in the early 2010s. And his interventions have very often conformed much more to the strategy of normalizing Le Pen and seeking good relations with her. In fact, even when Jean-Marie Le Pen made the presidential election second round for the first time in 2002, Kuckerman responded by commenting that Le Pen's relative breakthrough performance, getting 17, 18% of the vote, was a warning to Muslims, as in it showed French citizens' impatience at the behavior of Muslims, and therefore would serve as a kind of disciplining tool on their failure to adapt to French culture. More recently, in 2015, Kuckerman argued that Le Pen is maybe the leader of a party that includes Holocaust deniers, but is herself irreproachable in terms of matters of anti-Semitism. So the party may be burdened with this past, but she herself is trying to change things and can't herself be criticized on grounds of sort of anti-Semitism or association with this past. Indeed, during the recent debate about the November 12th march, another important historian, Nazi hunter, Serge Klaasfeld, he was interviewed in Le Figaro, and argued that the DNA of the far right is anti-Semitism. So if Le Pen is doing all this, she wants to attend a march against anti-Semitism, then that's good because it shows that she's embraced Republican values and she is leading her sort of political side away from the threat that they previously represented. And if we look at the more accomplished and already successful example of Giorgia Meloni in Italy, Le Pen is basically doing the same thing. The idea that she individually is leading a crusade against anti-Semitism, that she's in solidarity with Israel. Like, sure, the party might have an embarrassing past, but now it's seriously overcoming it. That kind of framing is working very well. So I began by saying that this show of solidarity with Israel is an important part of the mainstreaming of the far right in France, as in Italy before it. In the party, I think there's some internal debate over the prominence of sort of international issues or allegiance to a sort of US-led Western alliance in the process of raising it up to become a party of government. If we think maybe 7, 8, 9 years ago, Marine Le Pen had quite good relations with Vladimir Putin. The party sort of famously took out a big loan from a Russian bank because they said they couldn't get one in France. But more than that, sort of often praised Putin as a kind of civilizational model, defended the annexation of Crimea in 2014, this kind of thing. Whereas now other leaders in the party, such as Jordan Bardella, the party president, who's also a younger leader, basically argue that the party should abandon anything except the most total sort of Atlanticist, pro-Washington line, giving up even on a kind of Gaullist style triangulation. And clearly within this strategy, a expression of absolutely unconditional support for Israel clearly kind of works. It also very much follows the example of Meloni in Italy. But in all this, what really matters isn't so much the fact that far-right parties are willing to change their vocabulary or willing to take a pro-Israel position in a foreign and distant conflict. I think what's really important here is the fact that the signal they want to send is being positively received by mainstream media, including even liberal outlets, and welcomed by politicians basically across the spectrum of bourgeois politics. The idea of a sort of Republican cordon sanitaire against them is shared only by a very small minority of voters, and mostly ones who are positioned on the far left. And I think in this we can also see a change in the strategies of the liberal center of French politics, although one which is hardly unique to France, which is basically that it has different strategies for coping with the far right, which can sometimes be complementary, sometimes in contradiction. Basically with their sort of extreme poles, as on the one hand, the sort of call for voters to mobilize against the far right, saying there's a fascist threat, saying democracy is in danger, that it's imperative, whatever your other beliefs or whatever, to rally against this threat. Then on the other end of things, basically an accommodation to these parties, or even the claim that collaboration with them can serve to soften their edges, to normalize and mainstream them. So perhaps to put it rather schematically, the Democrat Party in the United States approach to Trump and his movement is clearly on the first end I mentioned, as in to say, well, you know, he's a fascist. This is fascism returning. But then on the other end of things, we see what the Christian Democrats in most European countries, and including in the EU itself, are now doing, which is to integrate parts of the far right into their own coalition on condition of unconditional support for NATO, and as it happens, also a unity of position on Israel-Palestine. So I think in the French case, what we've seen is basically while Macron in his own 2017 election bid relied heavily on the kind of idea of the anti-fascist, stop the barbarians at the gates kind of line, through his terms, we've broadly seen the exclusion, the cordon sanitaire, is instead basically only now aimed against the left, against France Insoumise in particular, and that French bourgeois opinion is ever more open to the idea of Marine Le Pen becoming president in 2027, is in fact preparing to ensure that that takes place as a soft landing. So I think it's also quite possible that even before that election, we could see things like a new parliamentary majority between the bourgeois right, the Republicans, and at least parts of Rassemblement National, and certainly a continuation of a process we're seeing already, which is parts of the bourgeois right directly defecting to Rassemblement National. So, in fighting against this, in terms of what the left does, I'm not at all arguing that calling Le Pen anti-Semitic or fascist, or trying to revive the kind of anti-fascist front strategy abandoned by liberals, is going to be enough to stop them. Rassemblement National's success relies precisely in its ability to simultaneously organize, give voice to discontent with neoliberalism's failure to realize its promises, but at the same time to propose very modest changes to French capitalism, and in particular things like access to welfare rights, to the identity of the state, and so on, as a means of actually realizing that promise which neoliberalism has failed to deliver. Its success is precisely that it's able to mobilize parts, indeed large parts of the working class, but also the middle classes, and even parts of kind of respectable bourgeois opinion. So I think, in what I've spoken about here and in the article I mentioned, a lot of the sort of rhetorical or polemical thrust is about the hypocrisy of liberal opposition to Le Pen, the way in which they're willing to give her a free pass, and so on. Still, I don't think that that's enough to mobilize against the Rassemblement National. The fundamental problem is how to build a left-wing alternative that is better, that is more convincing, that is able to mobilize people around their own material interests. Indeed, to show that class mobilization actually works, can actually achieve real improvements, can build something which isn't just stopping the far right, but carry through a democratization of French and indeed European political life. I think that's the real heart of the problem, is the failure of France Insoumise, although it's doing better than most, its failure to kind of realize that, and that's where it's met with its limit, which is that right-wing populism has to promise quite little to its supporters. It doesn't demand anything of them. It doesn't mobilize them. It doesn't organize social conflict. When Macron raised the retirement age, Le Pen opposes the rise in the retirement age, but also opposes the movement against it. The trade unions, the left are causing chaos. It's a kind of platonic critique of the failures of neoliberalism, but that because of its lack of any kind of truly radical social alternative, is able to bring together a very broad coalition of dissenting and critical groups. The problem for the left is that in the absence of recent examples of successful class mobilization, and in the absence of real party organization with roots and depth, it's difficult to convince people through just sort of electoral mobilization that its alternative is better, that its ideas aren't just utopian. So I have to say that I think that the prospects for the next French presidential election, certainly, and the French political scene in general right now are very gloomy, precisely because this bourgeois swinging behind Le Pen is very far advanced. The idea that she's some sort of pariah, the idea that there should be a block of other voters against her. For example, the notion that bourgeois liberal or centre-right voters would rally behind a left-wing candidate to stop her is now entirely a pious wish. I think all of those kind of barriers or thresholds have been quite thoroughly destroyed, and her expressions of solidarity with Israel and the painting of her by bourgeois opinion as a kind of this sort of overcoming of historic anti-Semitism, I think have played an important role in that. So, all this not to say that there's no criticism or whatever, but I think that what we're seeing is really a quite successful mainstreaming operation of her party. So there's lots more I could talk about, in particular about what the RM would actually do in government, but I've been speaking far longer than I expected, so I'll stop there.